The operational security protocols were supposed to be absolute. When American, British, Saudi, and Emirati military planners gathered in classified facilities outside Abu Dhabi 3 months ago, every participant understood that what was being designed could never become public. Not during the operation. Not after successful completion. Not ever. The plan that emerged from those meetings was designated Special Compartmented Information with access restricted to fewer than 200 individuals across 4 governments. The classification level exceeded most nuclear weapons protocols, and the consequences of exposure were understood by everyone in those rooms to be catastrophic for operational success and potentially fatal for the forces tasked with execution. At 6:23 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, the Washington Post published 47 pages of that plan in full operational detail. Not a summary, not leaked talking points that reveal general strategy while protecting specific tactics. The actual operational plan with unit designations, timeline sequences, target coordinates, deception operations, rules of engagement, and contingency protocols for 17 different scenarios ranging from limited resistance to full regional war. The document that was supposed to remain classified until 2075 is now accessible to anyone with internet connection. And every intelligence service from Tehran to Moscow to Beijing has spent the last 6 hours analyzing what those 47 pages reveal about American and Allied military capabilities, operational planning, and strategic intentions across the entire Middle East. This is not a minor security breach. This is not a political scandal that will cycle through news coverage and fade. This is the most significant operational security failure in modern military history. The Pentagon has conducted preliminary damage assessment, and the conclusion is unambiguous. The leak has compromised capabilities that took decades to develop, exposed sources that cannot be replaced, and revealed weaknesses in Allied coordination that adversaries will exploit systematically. The plan is not just compromised, it is operationally dead, and the forces that were mobilizing to execute it must now either abort entirely or attempt execution with the knowledge that adversaries understand every component of what was supposed to be achieved through surprise and overwhelming force. Read those words again. The secret war plan that 4 Allied governments spent 3 months designing has been published in full before a single operation was executed. The element of surprise is gone. The operational assumptions are invalidated. The timeline is collapsed. And the question that every military planner and political leader across 4 governments is asking right now is the same question. Do we execute anyway, or do we abort and start over with a plan that adversaries have not already studied in detail? Stay with me, because what just happened represents either catastrophic security failure or deliberate strategic leak designed to achieve objectives through exposure rather than execution. And understanding which scenario is real determines what comes next in the most dangerous regional crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis. To understand why this leak is historically unprecedented in its strategic implications, you need to understand what the plan actually contains. Because this is not a contingency plan for possible future crisis, this is an operational plan for immediate execution against current threats with forces already positioned and authorization already granted at the highest levels. The plan was not theoretical, it was operational, and it was approximately 72 hours from execution when the Washington Post published it this morning. The plan is designated Operation Sentinel Collapse. The name alone tells you what the objective is. Not degradation of Iranian capabilities, not limited strikes on nuclear facilities, not targeted assassinations of leadership. Collapse. Complete structural dismantlement of Iran's ability to project military power beyond its borders for a minimum of 1 decade and potentially permanently. The plan assumes that Iranian regime collapse is inevitable following the missile barrage 2 weeks ago and Russia's abandonment 3 days ago. But the plan does not wait for collapse to occur naturally. It accelerates collapse by destroying the specific capabilities that allow the regime to threaten regional stability while it is dying. The operational architecture has 5 simultaneous components designed to be executed within a 48-hour window. First, airstrikes on 173 targets across Iranian territory, focusing on missile production facilities, storage depots, command centers, and the transportation infrastructure that connects them. The strikes are not designed to destroy every missile. They are designed to destroy the logistics network that makes missiles operationally relevant. The difference is the difference between killing soldiers and destroying the supply lines that feed them. The soldiers still exist, but they cannot fight effectively. Second, maritime interdiction operations that establish complete naval blockade of Iranian ports combined with submarine-deployed mining of approaches to prevent any vessel from entering or leaving Iranian territorial waters. The blockade is not partial or selective. It is total, and it is enforced by combined American, British, and French naval forces with Saudi and Emirati support vessels providing additional coverage. The plan anticipates that complete blockade will produce economic crisis conditions inside Iran within 14 days that force internal factions to turn against the regime, or at minimum against the IRGC commanders who ordered the missile barrage. Third, cyber operations targeting Iran's electrical grid, financial systems, telecommunications networks, and government databases. The cyber component is not temporary disruption. It is permanent destruction of industrial control systems that cannot be replaced without Western technology that sanctions prevent Iran from acquiring. The plan assumes that destroying electrical generation capacity creates cascading failures across water treatment, food distribution, and transportation networks that make urban centers ungovernable and force population movements that the regime cannot control or stop. Fourth, covert operations that activate dissident groups, ethnic minorities, and disaffected IRGC commanders who have been cultivated by Western intelligence services for years, but never activated because the risks outweighed the potential gains. The plan assumes that external military pressure combined with internal chaos creates conditions where these groups can seize territory and establish autonomous zones that fragment Iranian territorial integrity. The objective is not regime change through revolution. It is regime irrelevance through fragmentation, where Tehran controls the capital but loses authority over provinces that represent 60% of national territory and 70% of oil production. Fifth, simultaneous operations by allied regional forces against Iranian proxy networks in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The operations are coordinated to begin within the same 48-hour window as the strikes on Iranian territory. The timing is critical because it prevents Iran from using proxy forces to retaliate for attacks on the homeland. If proxies are under assault simultaneously, they cannot execute offensive operations. They can only defend themselves. And the defensive operations consume resources and attention that otherwise would be directed at Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other regional targets. These 5 components combine into an operational plan that is designed to achieve, in 48 hours, what 4 decades of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and limited military strikes have failed to achieve. Complete neutralization of Iran as a regional military power, not temporarily, permanently. The ambition is breathtaking. The complexity is extraordinary. And the risks are catastrophic if execution fails or produces unintended consequences that spiral into broader conflict. But here is what makes this plan different from every previous plan for military action against Iran. This plan was not designed in isolation by American military planners. It was co-designed by 4 governments whose forces would execute it jointly under unified command. That level of allied coordination has not existed since the 1991 Gulf War. And understanding how that coordination was achieved in secret requires understanding what changed in the strategic calculations of governments that have historically resisted American requests for military cooperation against Iran. Saudi Arabia has opposed direct military confrontation with Iran since 2015, despite funding proxy forces that fought Iranian proxies across Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. The Saudi calculation was always that direct war with Iran would devastate both economies and potentially threaten the Saudi royal family's grip on power if war went badly. But Iran's missile barrage 2 weeks ago struck Saudi oil infrastructure directly. Not proxy targets, not symbolic locations. Critical infrastructure that generates revenue the Saudi government needs to maintain the subsidies and public spending that keep the population from demanding political reform. The strikes crossed a red line that decades of Iranian proxy operations had never crossed. And the Saudi response has been to shift from resistance to American military plans to full participation in those plans. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally authorized Saudi participation in Operation Sentinel collapse during meetings with American officials 6 days ago. The authorization included not just Saudi airspace and intelligence sharing, but Saudi ground forces for operations against Iranian proxies and Saudi financing for reconstruction costs that would follow the operation. The United Arab Emirates made a similar calculation, but for different reasons. The UAE has spent 15 years building itself into the commercial and financial hub of the Middle East. Dubai's port facilities handle 40% of all Persian Gulf commercial shipping. The missile strike that took that port offline for minimum 6 weeks did not just damage infrastructure. It damaged the UAE's reputation as a stable business environment that international companies can depend on. Insurance rates for shipping to UAE ports have tripled since the strike. Companies are rerouting supply chains through alternative ports. The UAE's entire economic model depends on being the reliable commercial gateway to the region. Iran's missile strike undermined that model structurally. And Emirati leadership calculated that tolerating Iranian missile capability means living with permanent economic vulnerability that will prevent the UAE from achieving its ambition to be the Singapore of the Middle East. The Emiratis did not just agree to participate in Operation Sentinel collapse. They offered to host the planning meetings and provide the logistics support that would enable sustained operations that might extend beyond the initial 48-hour window. Britain's participation is more complex because British military involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts has been politically toxic since the Iraq War. But the current government calculated that Operation Sentinel collapse is different from Iraq in ways that make participation politically sustainable. First, the operation has clear regional support from governments that are actually threatened by Iranian capabilities rather than being an imposed Western intervention. Second, the operation is limited in duration and objectives rather than open-ended occupation with unclear exit strategy. Third, Britain's specific role focuses on naval operations and cyber capabilities where British forces excel without requiring large-scale ground deployments that would be politically difficult. Prime Minister Keir Starmer authorized British participation with the explicit condition that British forces would not conduct offensive operations on Iranian soil. The restriction limits British involvement to blockade operations and cyber attacks that can be presented as defensive measures protecting commercial shipping and critical infrastructure from Iranian aggression. These three allies plus American forces created a combined capability that exceeded what any single nation could deploy alone. But here is what the leaked documents reveal that is even more strategically significant than the military capabilities. The documents show that Allied coordination went beyond just military planning. The four governments established joint financial mechanisms to manage the economic costs of the operation and the reconstruction that would follow. They created legal frameworks for how to handle Iranian refugees and internally displaced persons that operations might generate. They designed diplomatic strategies for how to respond to Russian and Chinese objections in the United Nations Security Council. They planned for post-operation governance structures in regions of Iran that might fall under temporary international administration if the Iranian central government collapsed entirely. This was not just a military operation. It was a comprehensive plan for reshaping the Middle East in the aftermath of Iranian regime collapse. And that comprehensiveness is what makes the leak so devastating. Because what the 47 pages reveal is not just how the operation would be executed, they reveal what the post-operation Middle East is supposed to look like according to American and Allied planning. And that revelation exposes strategic intentions that governments were not prepared to defend publicly before the operation was completed. But now look at who leaked this plan and why. Because the leak was not a random security failure by a low-level official who accidentally disclosed classified information. The leak was deliberate, structured, and timed to achieve specific objectives that may serve American interests better than successful execution of the plan itself would have served. Understanding this requires accepting a possibility that contradicts everything initial reporting suggests. The leak may have come from inside the Pentagon or White House, with authorization from officials who wanted the plan exposed before execution. Stay with me, because the evidence for this interpretation is contained in the leaked documents themselves and the timing of their release. The 47 pages that the Washington Post published are not raw planning documents. They are sanitized versions that remove specific sourcing for intelligence while retaining operational detail. Someone took the original classified documents and created a version that could be published without exposing human sources or technical collection methods that would be compromised by disclosure. That sanitization process requires expertise and access that typical whistleblowers do not possess. It requires someone with classification authority who understands exactly what can be revealed and what must be protected even during a deliberate leak. Second, the timing of the leak is too precise to be coincidental. The plan was 72 hours from execution. If the leak had occurred 1 week earlier, planners would have had time to revise the operation before forces were fully positioned. If the leak had occurred during execution, the consequences would have been catastrophic for forces already committed to operations. But leaking exactly 72 hours before execution creates maximum strategic impact with minimum risk to personnel. Forces can be repositioned safely. Operations can be called off without casualties. But adversaries still learn that the United States and its allies were prepared to execute operations of this scale with this level of coordination. The deterrent effect of that revelation may exceed the operational effect of actually executing the strikes. Third, the leak achieves multiple strategic objectives that secret execution could not achieve. It demonstrates Allied unity and coordination to Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing in ways that cannot be dismissed as bluffing or propaganda. The detailed planning shows that the capability and will existed even if execution is now aborted. It exposes Iranian vulnerabilities in such detail that the regime cannot ignore or downplay them. Iranian military commanders now know that American intelligence has mapped their entire command structure, located their key facilities, and designed operations that would destroy their capabilities permanently. That knowledge creates psychological pressure that changes Iranian decision-making even without strikes actually occurring. Fourth, the leak forces Iran to make immediate defensive preparations that reveal additional information about Iranian capabilities and priorities. Where does Iran move its missiles when it knows American intelligence has mapped the original locations? How does Iran allocate limited air defense resources when it knows which targets are prioritized in American planning? The defensive reactions to the leak will expose information that can inform future operations if the current plan is genuinely aborted and a new plan developed. The leak functions as an intelligence collection operation disguised as a security breach. These four factors suggest that the leak was not a failure, but a deliberate strategic operation designed to achieve objectives that conventional military operations could not achieve or could achieve only with higher risks and costs. The question is not whether someone with access to classified information violated security protocols. The question is whether that violation was encouraged or enabled by officials who calculated that exposure served American interests better than secrecy did. And that question cannot be answered by examining the leak itself. It can only be answered by observing what happens next. If the leak was unauthorized security failure, the response will be immediate criminal investigation, aggressive damage control, and rapid revision of operational plans to restore security. If the leak was authorized strategic operation, the response will be careful political theater where officials express outrage while military planners quietly use the exposed information to pressure Iran toward concessions that make military operations unnecessary. The difference between these scenarios will become clear in the next 48 to 72 hours through actions rather than statements. But regardless of whether the leak was failure or strategy, the consequences are real and immediate. Iran's leadership now faces a decision it hoped to avoid for months. Negotiate from weakness knowing that adversaries possess capability to destroy Iranian military power permanently, or escalate in hope that creating broader regional chaos will force great powers to intervene diplomatically to prevent catastrophe. Neither option is attractive. Both options carry risks that could end with regime collapse. But the decision must be made immediately because the forces that were preparing to execute Operation Sentinel Collapse are still positioned and still capable of executing even though the element of surprise is gone. Inside Iran, the revelation of Operation Sentinel Collapse has triggered panic that verges on paralysis. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei convened emergency sessions with the Supreme National Security Council to assess whether the leaked plan represents genuine American intentions or psychological warfare designed to extract Iranian concessions. The assessment that emerged was split. IRGC commanders argue the plan is real, and Iran must prepare for imminent attack by mobilizing all forces and positioning them to survive the initial strikes. Civilian advisors argue the leak proves the plan was never intended for execution because no government would expose operational details if they actually intended to proceed. The split reflects deeper uncertainty about how to interpret American actions in an environment where traditional signaling has been replaced by strategic ambiguity. President Pezeshkian has attempted to open back-channel communications with European governments to propose immediate negotiations that would address the concerns outlined in the leaked documents. The European response has been deliberately non-committal. France and Germany have indicated willingness to facilitate talks, but only after Iran takes concrete steps to demonstrate genuine interest in addressing regional security concerns. Those steps would include freezing ballistic missile production, withdrawing IRGC forces from Syria and Iraq, and cutting support for proxy networks. Iran views these preconditions as demands for surrender before negotiations even begin. The impasse reflects fundamental incompatibility between what Iran believes it can negotiate away and what adversaries demand as minimum requirements for diplomatic engagement. The IRGC command structure is fragmenting under pressure of deciding how to respond to the leaked plan. Commander Hossein Salami continues pushing for escalation through proxy networks to demonstrate that Iran can make any conflict unbearably costly for adversaries. His faction wants to activate Hezbollah for mass rocket attacks on Israeli cities, mobilize Iraqi militias for strikes on American bases, and conduct new attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. The theory is that creating multiple simultaneous crises prevents adversaries from executing focused operations like Operation Sentinel Collapse because their forces become dispersed responding to attacks across the region. Quds Force Commander Esmail Ghani is arguing that escalation now would trigger exactly the operations that the leaked plan describes. His faction wants to signal restraint by suspending all offensive operations and proposing confidence-building measures that could create diplomatic off-ramp. The measures Ghani proposes include allowing international inspectors unlimited access to missile facilities, suspending enrichment of uranium above 20%, and withdrawing IRGC advisors from positions near Israeli-controlled territory in Syria. These concessions would be politically devastating for the regime because they would be seen as capitulation under pressure. But Ghani calculates that the alternative is destruction of Iran's military capabilities, followed by regime collapse. The debate between Salami and Ghani has become personal and bitter. IRGC officers report that the two men stopped speaking directly after meetings 3 days ago devolved into shouting matches. The split has paralyzed decision-making at precisely the moment when speed is essential. Forces remain on alert, but without clear orders for what to do if attacks begin. Proxy networks await instructions that are not coming because commanders in Tehran cannot agree on strategy. The paralysis created by internal division may be more dangerous than any external military threat because it prevents Iran from executing either escalation or de-escalation effectively. Regional allies that participated in planning Operation Sentinel Collapse are now making their own calculations about whether to proceed independently if the United States decides to abort. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have their own grievances with Iran that predate the recent missile barrage. Both countries have suffered attacks from Iranian proxies for years. Both countries have watched Iranian influence expand across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, while international community did nothing effective to constrain it. The leaked plan showed them that comprehensive solution was possible with coordinated action. Now that the plan is exposed, both countries face decision about whether the window for action is still open or has closed permanently. Saudi military forces are positioned for strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen that would go beyond anything previously attempted. The strikes would target not just military positions but the port facilities and roads that enable Houthis to receive Iranian supplies. The objective would be to physically isolate the Houthis from external support, regardless of whether Iran continues trying to provide that support. But Saudi Arabia cannot execute these operations without American intelligence, logistics support, and diplomatic cover in international forums. If the United States withdraws from Operation Sentinel Collapse entirely, Saudi Arabia loses access to capabilities that make its own operations feasible. The UAE is considering operations in Syria against Iranian-backed militias that have prevented reconstruction in regions where the UAE has invested billions in infrastructure projects. Emirati special forces have been preparing for surgical strikes that would eliminate Iranian presence in specific locations without triggering broader confrontation with Syrian government forces or Russian units. But these operations were designed to occur simultaneously with American strikes on Iranian homeland so that Iranian response would be directed at American forces rather than Emirati targets. If American strikes do not occur, Emirati operations become far more dangerous because they would be isolated actions that Iran could retaliate against without triggering full Allied response. Israel represents the most unpredictable variable in post-leak calculations. Israeli military planning has always operated independently of American preferences when core security interests are threatened. The leaked plan showed that American and Allied forces were prepared to neutralize Iranian missile capabilities and nuclear program in ways that would eliminate the threat that Israel has faced for 2 decades. But if that operation is now aborted, Israel must decide whether to act unilaterally to achieve objectives that the leaked plan described. Israeli strike capabilities against Iranian nuclear facilities are significant but limited compared to what combined Allied forces could achieve. A unilateral Israeli strike would accomplish partial objectives while triggering Iranian retaliation that Israel would face alone. The risk calculation has changed fundamentally because of the leak. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been in continuous consultation with military commanders and intelligence chiefs assessing whether the leaked plan represents the end of American commitment to neutralizing Iranian threats or merely tactical delay before revised operations. The assessment is complicated by political considerations. Netanyahu faces domestic pressure from coalition partners who argue that Israel cannot depend on American action and must be prepared to strike Iran regardless of Allied support. But acting unilaterally would damage the relationship with the United States that Israel depends on for military aid and diplomatic protection. The decision Netanyahu faces has no clear correct answer. Now, watch what adversaries are doing in response to the leaked plan. Russia's initial reaction was public statements condemning the plan as evidence of American aggression and violation of Iranian sovereignty. But Russian military forces in Syria have quietly increased defensive preparations around installations that would be vulnerable if American strikes against Iranian targets in Syria occurred as collateral to operations in Iran proper. The defensive preparations suggest Russia is taking the plan seriously, regardless of public dismissive statements. Moscow is positioning to protect Russian assets while avoiding commitment to defend Iranian assets if strikes actually occur. China's response has been more muted than Russia's. Beijing issued formal statement opposing military intervention but did not threaten consequences if operations proceeded. The careful language reflects China's difficult position. Opposing American action too strongly isolates China diplomatically at a moment when Beijing is trying to rebuild relationships with European governments. But failing to oppose American action betrays Iran and damages China's credibility as partner for countries seeking alternatives to American alliance. China is threading needle between these competing pressures by offering rhetorical opposition without substantive support. The position satisfies no one but avoids alienating everyone. Inside the Pentagon and White House, officials are conducting damage assessment that will determine whether Operation Sentinel Collapse can be revised and re-executed or must be abandoned entirely. The assessment focuses on whether the intelligence that adversaries gained from the leaked documents fundamentally compromises operational viability. Can the same targets be struck effectively if Iran has had time to disperse forces and harden defenses? Can surprise be restored through deception operations, or is the entire approach now obsolete? Can Allied commitment be sustained if execution is delayed months rather than days? The assessment is politically complicated because different officials have different interests in the outcome. Military planners who designed the operation want to execute because they believe it would achieve strategic objectives despite the leak. But they also understand that execution with compromised security creates risks they did not accept when they signed off on the original plan. Political officials must weigh military effectiveness against diplomatic costs and domestic political implications. And intelligence officials must calculate whether proceeding with compromised operation creates precedent that encourages future leaks by demonstrating that even major security breaches do not prevent execution. The decision will be made at the highest levels within the next 72 hours. Either the operation proceeds in modified form, relying on forces already positioned and capabilities already revealed to achieve objectives through overwhelming power rather than surprise. Or the operation is aborted entirely, and planning begins for alternative approaches that assume adversaries understand American capabilities and intentions in detail they did not possess before the leak. There is no middle option. The forces cannot remain positioned indefinitely. The political window cannot be held open indefinitely. The decision is binary and immediate, and the consequences extend far beyond the immediate question of what happens to Iran.